Picture this. You're a trained naval officer operating sophisticated sonar equipment in some of the most monitored waters on Earth. Suddenly, your instruments detect something moving beneath the surface at impossible speeds, performing maneuvers no known submarine can achieve. You deploy divers to investigate. They surface moments later, shaken, reporting an intense underwater light and a metallic surface with no visible seams, hatches, or propulsion systems. Within hours, you're instructed never to speak of what you witnessed. The incident vanishes from official records. This isn't science fiction. This is the Shelburn Incident of 1960, and it's just one of dozens of documented encounters that suggest something extraordinary has been happening in the Atlantic Ocean for decades. Today, we're going deep into a pattern that military analysts, aviation experts, and researchers have noticed but rarely discuss publicly. The Atlantic Ocean appears to be a recurring location for some of the most credible, well-documented encounters with unidentified phenomena in modern history. But here's what makes this analysis different from typical UFO documentaries. We're not asking whether these events happened. The military records, pilot testimonies, declassified documents, and official investigations confirm they did. Instead, we're asking a more profound question. What do these incidents, when analyzed together, reveal about the limitations of our current understanding of physics, technology, and perhaps reality itself? We'll examine the common threads connecting these cases, explore why the Atlantic specifically features so prominently, and consider what the official responses to these incidents tell us about how institutions handle evidence that doesn't fit established frameworks. This isn't about proving aliens exist, it's about understanding what happens when highly trained observers encounter phenomena that challenge our assumptions about what's possible.
Before we dive into specific cases, we need to understand something crucial about how institutions respond when their personnel encounter something that doesn't fit within established categories of explanation. This pattern of response is remarkably consistent across decades and across different nations, and it tells us something important about how evidence is managed when it challenges existing frameworks. Let's start with Operation Mainbrace in 1952, because it establishes the template that would be repeated for the next 70 years. Here you have one of the largest NATO naval exercises since World War II, involving over 200 warships, more than 1,000 aircraft, and 80,000 personnel from 8 different nations. This wasn't some remote backwater operation. This was the North Atlantic, some of the most closely monitored airspace and maritime zones in Europe during the height of Cold War vigilance. Multiple military personnel from different nations operating different platforms reported observing large metallic objects performing maneuvers inconsistent with any known aircraft of the period. Royal Air Force pilots attempted intercepts. Naval officers logged sightings through standard military reporting channels. The objects were observed long enough for multiple independent confirmations. Now here's what's fascinating about the institutional response. British intelligence officials quickly ruled out meteorological phenomena, weather balloons, and atmospheric effects. They determined that the Soviet Union didn't possess aircraft capable of the observed performance. They quietly explored whether these were experimental NATO aircraft and rejected that explanation because no NATO member acknowledged ownership and no test programs were scheduled in the exercise area. The issue was raised in the British House of Commons. Government officials confirmed that unusual aerial phenomena had been reported by service personnel and stated that investigations had been conducted. But here's the critical part. They never offered a definitive explanation for the sightings. The Royal Air Force categorized the objects as unidentified and at no point officially attributed them to foreign aircraft, experimental technology, or natural phenomena.
This pattern appears again and again. Official acknowledgement that something was observed, systematic ruling out of conventional explanations, internal documentation that the phenomenon remains unidentified, and then, critically, public silence or ambiguity about what it actually was. The matter quietly fades from headlines, but the records don't disappear.
They persist in parliamentary transcripts, intelligence summaries, and historical analyses, creating a documentary trail that researchers can follow decades later. The Shelburn Incident of 1960 shows this pattern in an even striking form. According to testimonies that emerged decades later from naval veterans, Canadian naval vessels detected an anomalous sonar contact that didn't match friendly submarine signatures or known Soviet profiles. The object reportedly maneuvered vertically and horizontally, changing depth rapidly without acoustic characteristics associated with propeller-driven vessels. Navy divers allegedly entered the water and encountered an intense underwater light source before aborting the dive. Upon resurfacing, they described a smooth metallic surface lacking identifiable structures. Then, critically, participants were instructed not to discuss the incident. No public statement was issued. For decades, the event remained unknown outside a small circle of veterans and local residents. When researchers attempted to file access to information requests related to naval activity off Shelburne in 1960, responses indicated that no releasable records were available or that files could not be located. This absence is particularly significant because naval sonar data and diver operations are among the most tightly controlled categories of military information. The pattern here isn't conspiracy in the dramatic sense, it's institutional management of information that doesn't fit established categories. When trained personnel using advanced sensors detect something that behaves in ways not accounted for by known technology, the response isn't to trumpet the mystery. The response is to classify, contain, and maintain operational security while quietly attempting to determine what occurred. This brings us to a critical insight about these Atlantic cases. The credibility doesn't come from dramatic claims or spectacular evidence. It comes from the institutional paper trail. When the Brazilian Air Force conducts a months-long formal investigation called Operation Saucer, deploys military personnel to observation posts, systematically interviews witnesses, produces sketches and photographs, and then decades later declassifies portions of the files, confirming they investigated unidentified aerial phenomena without determining origin, that institutional acknowledgement carries weight, precisely because institutions are typically conservative about what they officially recognize as unexplained. When the United States Navy publicly confirms that videos circulating online are genuine recordings of unidentified aerial phenomena, as they did in 2019 regarding the East Coast encounters, that confirmation matters because it represents an institution acknowledging limits to its identification capabilities. The pattern we see across Atlantic cases is institutions following their procedures, ruling out conventional explanations through systematic analysis, documenting what remains unexplained, and then managing that uncertainty through classification or limited public disclosure. This isn't about cover-ups in the Hollywood sense. It's about how bureaucracies handle edge cases that fall outside their operational frameworks. And the fact that this pattern persists across different nations, different time periods, and different institutional contexts suggests we're seeing a genuine phenomenon of encounters with something that resists easy categorization within existing knowledge systems. To understand why the Atlantic features so prominently in these cases, we need to understand something about the unique surveillance environment it represents. The Atlantic Ocean, particularly the North Atlantic, is arguably the most monitored body of water in human history. This monitoring didn't begin recently. It has Cold War roots that created a detection infrastructure of remarkable sophistication. During the Cold War, the primary concern for NATO was Soviet submarine movements. The Greenland-Iceland-UK gap represented a strategic choke point that Soviet submarines would need to traverse to reach the open Atlantic and threaten Western sea lanes. This concern drove the development of the Sound Surveillance System, known as SOSUS, a classified network of underwater hydrophones designed to detect and track submarine activity across vast distances. These weren't simple listening devices. They were precision instruments capable of detecting acoustic signatures at ranges that would astonish most people. The system could track a submarine crossing from one side of the Atlantic to the other, distinguishing between different vessel classes based on subtle acoustic characteristics. But here's what's crucial for our analysis. SOS-US didn't just detect submarines, it detected anything that produced acoustic energy underwater. When the USS Scorpion was lost in 1968, SOS-US operators reviewing recordings from the North Atlantic identified a series of acoustic events in the vicinity of the submarine's last known location. What they found raised immediate questions. Instead of a single catastrophic implosion, which is what you'd expect from a submarine hull failing under depth pressure, the recordings showed multiple acoustic events separated by brief intervals. This suggested either a staged failure or a sequence of events rather than a single instantaneous collapse. Naval analysts concluded the Scorpion had been lost suddenly, but the precise cause remained unclear even after the wreck was located at a depth of roughly 9,800 feet.
The acoustic timeline suggested rapid events rather than slow descent into failure. Some analysts argued the initial signature resembled an explosion rather than passive collapse. Certain acoustic signals remain classified or have only been summarized, not released in full. This is significant because it demonstrates that even with some of the most sophisticated acoustic monitoring equipment ever developed, operating in an environment specifically designed for submarine detection, ambiguity can persist when the data doesn't conform to expected patterns. Above the water, the Atlantic airspace over the eastern seaboard and European approaches represents some of the most controlled and monitored airspace on Earth. Commercial aviation routes crisscross the region constantly. Military aircraft conduct continuous patrols. Radar coverage is layered and redundant. Air traffic control systems track every transponder-equipped aircraft. And yet, within this intensively monitored environment, trained observers have repeatedly encountered objects that evade immediate identification. The East Coast UAP encounters of 2014 and 2015 are particularly instructive here. Navy pilots operating off the eastern seaboard began encountering unidentified aerial objects during routine training missions. These weren't isolated sightings. According to pilot accounts, the objects appeared repeatedly, sometimes daily, over a period of months. They were detected on multiple sensor systems simultaneously, visually by pilots, tracked by radar, and recorded by infrared sensors. The pilots were operating FA-18 Super Hornets equipped with upgraded APG-79 active electronically scanned array radar systems, representing a significant leap in detection capability over older mechanically scanned radars. What makes these encounters significant isn't just that objects were detected. It's that they were detected in restricted military training airspace, where every aircraft should be accounted for, using some of the most advanced sensors available by pilots whose job requires accurate threat identification. When these pilots filed safety reports, which are procedural steps reserved for events that pose potential flight hazards, that action alone indicates the encounters were taken seriously from an operational standpoint. Safety reports aren't filed for curiosities or speculative sightings. They're filed when something creates a potential collision risk or flight safety concern. The subsequent acknowledgement by the United States Navy that the videos circulating online were genuine recordings of unidentified aerial phenomena, followed by the release of those videos by the Department of Defense, represents an institutional recognition that something was observed which could not be identified through standard procedures. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence Preliminary Assessment on UAPs, released in 2021, stated that some UAPs appeared to demonstrate unusual flight characteristics, including high acceleration and the ability to remain stationary in strong winds. The report didn't identify the objects, that's the point. Even with advanced detection systems, institutional acknowledgement, and formal investigation, identification remained elusive. This brings us to a paradox at the heart of Atlantic encounters. The very sophistication of the surveillance environment should make misidentification less likely. Radar operators are trained to distinguish clutter from contacts. Pilots are trained observers familiar with optical illusions and atmospheric effects. Sonar technicians understand acoustic propagation and can differentiate between biological, mechanical, and environmental sounds. The detection infrastructure is specifically designed to identify and track objects operating in air and sea. And yet, across decades, trained personnel using advanced sensors in this highly monitored environment have reported encounters with phenomena that resist categorization within known frameworks. This suggests something important. The credibility of Atlantic cases doesn't come from lack of observation capability. It comes from the sophistication of the observation capability, combined with the inability to reconcile observations with known categories of explanation. When a commercial pilot with thousands of flight hours operating in tightly controlled Channel Islands airspace, monitored by UK and French air traffic services, reports observing two bright objects for several minutes that don't display navigation lights, contrails, or aircraft silhouettes, and when a second commercial pilot in separate aircraft reports the same objects to air traffic control, and when those objects don't appear on radar despite being in coverage, that combination of professional observation, corroboration, and sensor ambiguity creates a puzzle that simple dismissal can't resolve.
Among all the unusual characteristics reported in Atlantic encounters, one stands out as particularly challenging to conventional frameworks: objects that appear to transition between air and water without the expected physical signatures of such transitions. This capability, if genuine, would represent something genuinely anomalous because it violates our understanding of how objects interact with different mediums. The Aguadilla incident of 2013 provides one of the clearest sensor-recorded examples of this reported capability. A U.S. Customs and Border Protection aircraft conducting maritime surveillance along Puerto Rico's northwestern coast detected a small heat-emitting object on its forward-looking infrared sensor. The object was initially detected at low altitude, traveling just offshore over the Atlantic. As the sensor tracked the object, it displayed smooth, continuous movement, passing over populated areas and the airport perimeter while remaining at low altitude. Then, according to the FLIR footage, the object entered the ocean. The recording shows the object descending toward water and continuing forward motion without visible deceleration. There's no apparent splash, no abrupt thermal bloom, no indication of impact disruption. The object appears to transition from air to water while maintaining coherence as a heat source. The crew continued tracking the object underwater. The FLIR sensor, while optimized for air surface tracking, retained a thermal signature consistent with the target's movement beneath the waterline. The object maintained stable trajectory and didn't exhibit turbulence patterns associated with propellers or jets. Then, most remarkably, the thermal signature appeared to split into two distinct objects moving in parallel beneath the surface. After several seconds underwater, both objects resurfaced and continued moving westward away from shore before fading from sensor range.
Now, this case has been subject to extensive debate. When the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, known as AARO, reviewed the footage, they offered an analytical assessment suggesting the object was likely a small airborne object, possibly a balloon or drone, whose apparent speed and behavior were misinterpreted due to parallax effects, sensor resolution limits, and environmental factors. According to AARO's analysis, the underwater segment didn't represent true submersion, but rather the object moving behind waves and thermal clutter near the water surface. The apparent split could be explained by the sensor resolving multiple thermal reflections, or by the object separating into components. However, independent analysts, including engineers and former sensor operators, have contested this assessment. They point to the object's speed relative to background features, the consistency of the thermal signature underwater, and the lack of expected disturbances. The discrepancy in speed estimation is particularly notable. Early analyses suggested speeds exceeding 100 knots, which would rule out common balloons or small drones. AARO's assessment argued the object was closer and slower than initially assumed, significantly reducing the estimated speed.
This highlights a fundamental challenge in sensor-based cases. Without known range to target, speed calculations depend heavily on assumptions. What makes Transmedium reports significant isn't that they definitively prove exotic technology, it's that they represent a category of observation that, if accurate, would require explanations outside current frameworks. Water is roughly 800 times denser than air. Objects moving through water experience dramatically different resistance than objects moving through air. Conventional aircraft cannot simply dive into water and continue powered flight because the medium change would overwhelm their propulsion systems and structural integrity. Submarines cannot leap from water into air and maintain controlled flight because they lack the necessary lift surfaces and thrust-to-weight ratios.
If objects are genuinely transitioning between these mediums without the expected physical signatures of such transitions, without visible splash dynamics, without deceleration curves consistent with drag differentials, without propulsion changes appropriate to medium density, then we're observing something that doesn't conform to our models of how propulsion and aerodynamics work. This is why the Shelburn case from 1960 remains intriguing despite lack of declassified documentation. The reported sequence, sonar detection of submerged object with anomalous movement characteristics, diver deployment, encounter with intense underwater light source, smooth metallic surface lacking identifiable structures, immediate suppression of discussion, represents a pattern that would later appear in other accounts. The consistency isn't proof, but it's notable. The Colares incidents in Brazil during 1977 and 78 add another dimension. During Operation Saucer, the Brazilian Air Force investigation, military observers documented objects that appeared over water before moving inland, objects capable of hovering silently, objects emitting directed beams of light. While most attention focused on the physical effects on witnesses and the formal military investigation, the geographic pattern is significant. The events centered on Colares Island near the mouth of the Amazon River, where inland waterways meet the Atlantic Ocean. The proximity to water in these encounters isn't coincidental if you're looking for patterns. Similarly, the Canary Islands mass sightings of 1976 involved witnesses describing large, luminous objects emerging from the western horizon over the Atlantic, rising vertically from the ocean, expanding as they ascended. Witnesses described the objects developing concentric rings or layered illumination, with some reporting a transparent outer shell with brighter core and a central column or beam extending downward toward the sea. The Spanish Air Force investigation considered missile tests as an explanation, but encountered difficulties reconciling that hypothesis with the reported emergence from ocean and subsequent structured appearance. When we examine Transmedium reports across multiple cases, what emerges isn't definitive proof of any particular explanation. What emerges is a category of observation that consistently challenges conventional frameworks. Trained observers report objects behaving in ways that our current understanding of propulsion, aerodynamics, and materials science suggests shouldn't be possible. The institutional responses range from acknowledging the observations while declining to explain them, as with Operation Mainbrace, to offering conventional explanations that don't fully account for all reported characteristics, as with the Aguadilla assessment, to maintaining classification and silence, as with Shelburn. The Transmedium question matters because it represents a test case for how we handle observations that fall outside established categories. Do we dismiss them because they conflict with current models? Do we modify our models to accommodate verified observations? Or do we maintain ambiguity, acknowledging what was observed while remaining uncertain about what it represents? The Atlantic cases suggest institutions have largely chosen the third option, creating a growing archive of documented encounters that resist easy categorization while avoiding definitive claims about what they represent. One of the most perplexing aspects of the Atlantic phenomenon isn't the encounters themselves, it's what happens to evidence after encounters occur. The pattern of evidence disappearance, official ambiguity about materials' authenticity, and decades-long delays in declassification suggests something important about how institutions manage information that doesn't fit established frameworks.
The USS Trephang photograph controversy exemplifies this problem. Images allegedly taken during a 1971 patrol in the North Atlantic near Jon Mayen, roughly between Iceland and Norway, depict large, unusual objects, apparently rising from or hovering above the ocean, captured against polar skies. Some images show what appears to be a disc-shaped or elongated object partially emerging from water. Others show a tall, plume-like form or dark silhouette suspended above the sea surface. These images are striking, and their attribution to USS Trephang operations has circulated widely among researchers. But here's the evidentiary challenge. No publicly released U.S. Navy document confirms that Trephang photographed an unidentified object in 1971. Official deck logs, patrol routes, and photographic records from submarine operations are rarely released, even decades later. The photographs entered public domain decades after the alleged event, often presented as copies or scans of printed images, some marked with handwritten notations suggesting naval origin. Several images include handwritten captions such as USS Trephang, Jon Mayen, and 1971. However, the handwriting has never been authenticated, and no original negatives have been produced for independent examination. This absence of original material is the central problem in evaluating the case. Without chain of custody documentation, without original negatives, without official confirmation of source, the images exist in an evidentiary limbo. They're visually interesting, they show features consistent with maritime environments and analog film from the early 1970s, but they cannot be definitively attributed to the claimed source. The U.S. Navy has never confirmed their authenticity. Requests for confirmation have received either no response or general statements that the Navy doesn't comment on alleged classified material.
This pattern appears repeatedly. Evidence emerges without context. Context remains classified or lost. Interpretation fills the gap. The Rex Heflin Santa Ana photographs from 1965 show this dynamic in even more troubling fashion. Heflin, a highway inspector in California, photographed a disc-shaped object using his Polaroid camera during a routine workday. The images showed a structured disc with dome center tilting against the California horizon. The photographs were clear, taken in daylight by a government employee using a camera that couldn't easily be manipulated. After the photographs appeared in newspapers, Heflin received a phone call from someone claiming to represent NORAD, requesting the original Polaroids for analysis. Shortly afterward, two men in identical black suits appeared at his office, presented no identification, and insisted on receiving the originals immediately. Heflin handed them over. The photographs were never returned. Subsequently, a black sedan began appearing near Heflin's home and office. Two men in suits visited his house, asking his daughter specific questions about whether additional photographs existed. The psychological weight of these visits profoundly affected Heflin's life. He stopped giving interviews, became more guarded, measured his words carefully. The contradiction is striking. If the photographs were worthless, why did men invoking NORAD and Air Force Office of Special Investigations come to seize the originals? Why did Heflin's family endure surveillance? The Air Force, through Project Blue Book, dismissed the case, suggesting the photos could have been staged, but that public dismissal doesn't reconcile with the private attention the case received. This pattern, public dismissal combined with private interest, appears across multiple cases and suggests institutional ambiguity about how to handle evidence that doesn't fit established categories.
The evidence management problem extends beyond photographs. In the Colares case, when the Brazilian government declassified portions of Operation Saucer files in 1994, researchers noted that significant portions of material appeared to be missing, particularly detailed medical analyses and higher quality imagery referenced in summaries. The files that were released confirmed the Air Force had conducted formal investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena without determining origin. But the selective nature of what was released leaves questions about what remains classified. Similarly, with the East Coast Navy encounters, raw radar data has not been released, citing classification concerns. This limits independent verification and keeps analysis dependent on summaries and testimony. When the public can't access the underlying data, assessment becomes dependent on trusting institutional analysis. And when institutional analysis itself acknowledges that some cases remain unidentified, we're left with documented uncertainty rather than documented explanation. This creates a peculiar epistemic situation. We have institutional acknowledgement that encounters occurred. We have documentation that conventional explanations were considered and found insufficient. We have witness testimony from credible observers. But we lack the kind of comprehensive, independently verifiable evidence that would allow definitive conclusions. The evidence that does exist is managed through classification systems that limit access, through selective declassification that releases some material while withholding other material, and through institutional statements that acknowledge observation while declining explanation. What does this pattern tell us? It suggests institutions are managing genuine uncertainty. They're not simply covering up known answers. They're documenting encounters that resist easy categorization while maintaining operational security about detection capabilities, sensor performance, and intelligence collection methods. The result is an archive of acknowledged encounters that remain officially unexplained, creating a documentary record that confirms something unusual has been observed while leaving the fundamental question of what it represents unresolved. When we step back and look at the Atlantic encounters as a whole, examining not individual cases but the pattern they form collectively, several implications emerge that go beyond questions of whether specific incidents involved exotic technology. First, these cases demonstrate the limits of even sophisticated detection systems when confronted with phenomena that don't conform to expected categories. The Atlantic represents one of the most monitored environments on Earth, with layered radar coverage, acoustic sensor networks, continuous military and civilian traffic, and institutional frameworks specifically designed to identify and track objects operating in air and sea. And yet, within this environment, trained personnel using advanced sensors have repeatedly encountered phenomena that resist identification through standard procedures. This tells us something important about the gap between our detection capabilities and our interpretive frameworks. We can detect things we cannot explain. That gap between observation and explanation is where these cases live. Second, the institutional response pattern reveals how bureaucracies handle edge cases that fall outside operational frameworks. The response isn't dramatic suppression in the Hollywood sense, it's procedural management. Follow investigation protocols, rule out conventional explanations, document what remains unexplained, classify based on source protection and operational security, and maintain ambiguity in public statements. This creates an archive of documented uncertainty, events that are officially acknowledged as having occurred but officially unexplained regarding what they represent. This pattern persists across different nations, different time periods, different institutional contexts, suggesting we're seeing a genuine phenomenon of encounters with something that institutions don't have frameworks to definitively categorize. Third, the geographic concentration in the Atlantic is itself informative. If these encounters were entirely random or explained by misidentification of conventional phenomena, we wouldn't expect geographic clustering. But the Atlantic, and particularly the North Atlantic, appears repeatedly. This could reflect observation bias. The region is heavily monitored, so encounters are more likely to be detected and documented. But it could also suggest something about the phenomenon itself, that it has affinity for maritime environments, or that the specific characteristics of the Atlantic, its depth, its strategic importance, its role in global commerce and military operations, make it a region of particular interest to whatever is behind these encounters. Fourth, the pattern of evidence management, the photographs that disappear, the files that remain classified, the selective declassification of materials, the institutional acknowledgement paired with explanatory ambiguity, suggests we're dealing with information that institutions find genuinely difficult to manage.
It's not that they're hiding simple answers, it's that they don't have simple answers, and admitting that publicly while maintaining operational credibility creates tension. The result is a kind of managed ambiguity where enough is acknowledged to satisfy documentation requirements, while enough remains unexplained or classified to avoid having to make definitive claims about what was observed. What does all this mean for our understanding? The Atlantic encounters, examined collectively, suggest we may be dealing with something genuinely anomalous, not necessarily extraterrestrial, not necessarily beyond human capability to eventually explain, but genuinely outside our current frameworks of understanding. The alternative, that all these cases represent misidentification, equipment malfunction, or deliberate deception, requires dismissing extensive testimony from trained observers, ignoring institutional documentation that these events were investigated and found unexplained, and assuming a level of incompetence or dishonesty among military and civilian personnel that seems implausible across this many independent cases. The more measured conclusion is that something has been happening in the Atlantic Ocean and its approaches that resists easy categorization within existing knowledge systems. Trained observers have encountered phenomena displaying characteristics that our current understanding of propulsion, aerodynamics, and material science suggest shouldn't be possible. Institutions have documented these encounters, investigated them using standard procedures, ruled out conventional explanations where possible, and arrived at official conclusions that acknowledge observation while declining explanation.
This leaves us with documented uncertainty. And perhaps that's the most important implication of the Atlantic pattern. It reveals the limits of our current frameworks, not because those frameworks are wrong, but because they're incomplete. There are observations that don't fit cleanly into categories we've constructed. There are phenomena that trained personnel detect using sophisticated sensors that nonetheless resist identification. There are questions that remain unresolved despite institutional investigation. The Atlantic encounters don't prove any particular extraordinary claim. What they demonstrate is that even in the 21st century, even with remarkable technology and extensive monitoring infrastructure, there are aspects of our world that remain genuinely mysterious. The ocean that connects continents, facilitates commerce, and has been traversed by humans for millennia still holds phenomena we cannot fully explain. And perhaps the most profound revelation from examining these cases collectively isn't what they tell us about UFOs or unexplained phenomena. It's what they tell us about the boundaries of human knowledge and the institutional challenges of acknowledging when something falls outside those boundaries. The Atlantic will continue to be monitored. New detection systems will be deployed, more encounters will likely occur, and the pattern will likely persist. Observation, investigation, documentation, and ultimately, uncertainty. Because some questions, it seems, resist easy answers, and some phenomena, despite our best efforts at categorization, remain at the edges of what we can definitively explain. What we're left with is an invitation to intellectual humility, to acknowledge that credible observations exist that we cannot fully explain, to recognize that institutional ambiguity sometimes reflects genuine uncertainty rather than concealment, and to accept that the Atlantic Ocean, for all our monitoring and all our technology, still holds mysteries that challenge our assumptions about what's possible in our world.